Welcome back to Grade 8 History, Unit Number 2, Canada's Changing Society, 1890 to 1914. This is Lesson Number 21, How did the government respond to increasing immigration? How did people in Canada react to immigration? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. Would there be groups of immigrants that Canadians and their government might have wanted to forbid to enter the country during the period 1896 to 1914? Why might these groups be excluded? I'd like you to put the video on pause now so that you can write down your response to these two questions that I just read. And let's begin. People often have to meet certain requirements before they can move to another country. The government decides who is allowed to move to Canada by establishing immigration laws. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the government focused on restricting immigration for certain groups of people. This meant that immigrants from some countries were welcomed, while others from quote unquote less desirable countries were excluded. Chinese immigrants were accepted when the government was in need of laborers to complete the railway. However, once the railway was completed, the government created policies meant to exclude Chinese immigrants. In 1885, the government introduced the Chinese head tax. This tax required a Chinese immigrant to pay $50 in order to enter Canada. The tax was increased steadily. By 1905, the head tax was $500, which made it almost impossible for an entire family to move to Canada. Only one family member could move, and it would take years for a Chinese immigrant to raise enough money to bring other family members to Canada. And here you see a scan of one of these head taxes that were written on rather official looking letterhead. And my question here is, how do you think a Chinese immigrant would feel about the head tax? So please put the video on pause once more so that you can write down your response to this question. Let's continue. When Frank Oliver replaced Clifford Sifton as Minister of the Interior in 1905, he wanted to create policies that restricted diverse groups of immigrants. In 1906, he introduced the Immigration Act. This act increased the government's power to restrict immigration, deport people, and create regulations that unfairly targeted people considered undesirable. The adjustments made to the Act in 1910 strengthened these powers and gave the government a new power to restrict immigration. And here I've put an excerpt from the Immigration Act of 1910. And we will learn about the impact of this section of the Act on the next 3 slides. If you want to put the video on pause, you can so that you can read this excerpt. Alright, let's continue. This new power was the quote-unquote continuous journey regulation. This regulation stated that if a person wanted to move to Canada, they had to make one non-stop journey from their country of origin to Canada. If the person spent time living in another country before resuming their journey to Canada, they would not be allowed to enter Canada. The regulation was used to prevent black farmers in Oklahoma from immigrating to Canada on the grounds that they were citizens of British Guiana and not the U.S. The continuous journey regulation also made it nearly impossible for Asian immigrants to enter Canada. In May of 1914, a Japanese steamship named the Komagata Maru arrived in Vancouver. The ship had journeyed from Hong Kong and was carrying 376 passengers from India, most of whom were male and chic. The passengers were refused entry to Canada and were told to return to India. They refused and remained on board the ship in the Vancouver harbor for 2 months. As politicians debated about what to do with the passengers, the Canadian government denied food and water to the passengers. A committee of South Asian citizens organized protests on their behalf and managed to get the passengers some provisions. The government forced the ship to leave in July of 1914. When the ship returned to India 2 months later, British officials tried to arrest 20 of the passengers who they saw as leaders. This resulted in a riot which left another 20 passengers shot. And in 2014, the 100th anniversary of the Komagata Maru incident was commemorated. BC Premier Christy Clark issued a long overdue apology on behalf of the provincial government. The immigration boom had a strong effect on Canadian society. What had once been the First Nations, British, and French society was now increasingly multicultural. Unlike today, Canadians were uncomfortable with seeing newcomers speaking different languages, practicing different customs, wearing different styles of clothing, and eating different foods. And you can see that in this political cartoon. Sadly, this cartoon does a very good job of summarizing Canada's racist immigration policy during the early 1900s. Many Canadians of British origin were concerned that the increasing cultural diversity posed a threat to their way of life. Letters, books, and political cartoons from the period 1896 to 1914 portrayed negative stereotypes about immigrants. These sources revealed that there was an unfortunately high level of racism amongst Canadians. And we've heard about this man in a previous lesson, but just to repeat, J.S. Wordsworth was a Protestant minister and missionary before entering Canadian politics. He supported the argument that British immigrants were ideal settlers and that other cultural groups should be excluded. On the west coast, a rise in Chinese and Japanese immigration contributed to anti-Asian attitudes. Anti-immigration rallies were held, and stores and businesses that were owned by Japanese and Chinese people were damaged. It sometimes took hours for police to control the rioters who attended these rallies. Due to society's pressures, in 1908, the Canadian government reached a deal with Japan. Japan agreed to limit immigration of male Japanese laborers to 400 per year. And here we see a photo from a riot on Powell Street in Vancouver in 1907. My question for you is, how do you think the damage shown in this photo affected the Asian communities living here? Please put the video on pause so that you can write your response to this question. Let's continue. Between 1905 and 1911, about 1,500 black farmers from the U.S. settled in Western Canada. Although the government did not enact any official regulations to limit the immigration of black people to Canada, members of the government did use indirect methods to discourage black Americans from immigrating. For example, a Canadian government agent working in the U.S. refused to respond to any written requests from black people looking to move to Canada. Some government employees had information published in letters and newspapers claiming that the climate in Canada was horrible, that food in Canada was scarce and cost twice as much as American food. Just as an example, the Oklahoma Guide was one paper that Canadian agents liked to use to discourage black farmers from coming to Canada. Sadly, the Edmonton Municipal Council went so far as to send a petition to Wilfrid Laurier, still the Prime Minister at the time, to stop the immigration of black people. By 1912, black immigration to Alberta had almost completely stopped. Thankfully, the black communities which had already been established there continued to grow. And here we see a photo of the Darby family who lived in Fulton, Alberta in 1903. My question here is, what do their clothes suggest about their daily lives? So please put the video on pause so that you can write down your response to this question. And let's bring this video to a close. Let's finish today's lesson by considering the following. First, what do you think were the short-term and long-term consequences of restricting certain groups of immigrants? Second, why is it important to keep artifacts such as Chinese tax certificates and to study hurtful events like the 1907 riots in Vancouver? And finally, what things do you see in your community that show reactions to diversity have improved or stayed the same? I'd like you to put the video on pause one last time so that you can write down your responses to these questions. If you find you're having difficulty with answering any of these questions, I'd like you to watch this video again at least one more time, and then when you're ready, put the video on pause one last time to write down your answers to these questions. And I look forward to hearing your responses to these 3 questions in tomorrow's class. But for now, this concludes today's video.